tonight we're going to present an argument which presents the view that we are human beings, which is not that controversial obviously, but we are physical living beings created in the image of God. And we live in a world, of course, which has rejected God and is currently facing chaos, in my opinion. The question which we'd like to look at tonight is, how did we get here? Before we get into that, my sort of sub-theme is, we don't have bodies, we are bodies, to give you some idea of where we're going. Now, just as a slight aside, some of you might know the Killers. There might even be people in the room that recently went to a concert when they were in Australia, but we won't be pointing people out. You'll notice that their top songs are there off Spotify, and their fourth song, Human, which was their first hit, has been listened to 500 million times on Spotify, and that's just that version on that particular album. The lyrics go something like this, and there'll be people in the room that know the lyrics very well. Will your system be all right when you dream of home tonight? There is no message we're receiving. Let me know, is your heart still beating? Are we human or are we dancer? My sign is vital, my hands are cold, and I'm on my knees looking for the answer. Pay my respects to grace and virtue, send my condolences to good. Give my regards to soul and romance, they always did the best they could. So long to devotion, you taught me everything I know. Wave goodbye, wish me well, you've got to let me go. Are we human or are we dancer? That might seem like quite an obscure set of lyrics, but what we're going to see tonight is that is a particular set of lyrics which reflect brilliantly the thinking of today. And that's what we're going to look at. So the question is, of course, well, when we speak of the world we live in and where we are today, where are we today? Well, we live in a world which you could say has an obsession with body image. That is one thing that we could definitely say. Tattoos are on the rise. In fact, if you watch sport, if you're into AFL, extraordinary the amount of people that play AFL that have AFLs, have tattoos, just as an example. But all sorts of other things, and you could go on and look at that in many different ways. That's not quite a new thing, but it's definitely on the rise. We, of course, live in a world which has changed remarkably over the last decade or so with same-sex legislation, same-sex marriage legislation. And that has sort of swept the world, been quite a change over the last decade or so. But it's actually gone beyond that, hasn't it? Because now we're in a stage where there's same-sex affirmation, where it's no longer not enough to simply sort of allow or to tolerate same-sex activity, but we're actually expected to affirm it. And I know I, along with other people in the room, have been asked to sort of stand by rainbow flags while we take pictures of the office, to promote certain times of the year and so on and so forth. Another thing that swept the world is transgenderism, and we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about that. Transgenderism is on the rise, and we hear about it, and probably every paper you picked up today would have something about transgenderism in it. Proposed changes to Canada's criminal code relating to conversion therapy. We've seen that in Australia, in Victoria in particular. That legislation is coming to New South Wales, and I suspect with the new government in New South Wales that will probably come quicker than it might have otherwise. But it's the sort of legislation that is sweeping the world. One document says, or one paper says, nearly 40% of US Gen Zs, 30% of young Christians identify in this way. I gave this talk in Melbourne a little while ago, and one of the brethren, someone you actually probably know, his daughter goes to a Christian college. There's 14 girls in her class, and between 5 and 6 and 7, around that number, around 40% identify either as transgender or gender neutral in this Christian college. So the numbers are rising rapidly. Another thing that is front of mind and continues to be argued over the last few decades, of course, is abortion. A particularly challenging subject in many ways. And by the time we've finished our session tonight, there will have been 10,000 abortions on the earth today, in the world today, 10,000. There's nearly 10,000 abortions per hour conducted around the world. Another subject which is coming to mind is euthanasia. This is a hot topic that's going to be debated, and the ageing population, of course, is having an impact on this. And so these subjects all are incredibly challenging ethical subjects which are coming to the fore today. And what I'd like to suggest tonight is that it is no coincidence. It's no coincidence that this group of subjects are all coming to the fore at this time. They might seem like unrelated subjects. They might seem like they're a little bit different from one from the other. You might see some connection between some of them. But what we're going to suggest tonight is there's an underlying philosophy which supports all of this thinking, that supports this way of thinking. And hence the subject tonight, and that is, does God care about your body? What does God think about your body? Is your body important to God? And that would have seemed like a particularly unusual question to ask probably a generation ago. How do you view your body? What's God's plan for your body? But today it's actually an important question. And of course the underlying question is there a distinction between you and your body? Are they two separate things? And that's what we want to talk a bit about tonight. And I feel like if we get that sorted out and we get it clear in our mind how God views us, this will help us sort of make sense of what's happening around us. It will also will help us to navigate our way through and understand how God would like us to view ourselves. And so we'd like to get an understanding tonight as to these things. So a bit of an agenda. We just talked about where we are, where is the here, if you like, and we're going to talk about this new idea of the self. We then want to go right back actually to some early thinking, right back to Plato. We'll be moving through some of this stuff pretty quickly, and then moving into some of the thinking that has changed the world, and then talk about the sexual revolution a little bit, and then finish with some scriptures to show how the scriptures are quite at odds with the way the world is thinking today. Well, how would you describe where we are today in a nutshell? How would you summarise it? Well, at the heart of the modern world is the self. So the way we view ourselves, and that has changed. And it's not just sort of the fact that we know that we're individual beings in a world. It's actually more than that. It's the idea of a self-identity. And this concept that I am born for the very purpose of establishing and creating my own identity. And this identity must be allowed to emerge in my life. It's sort of the opposite, really, of I learn to control my feelings and I need to act with restraint, and there's a world which is a reality that I need to conform to and live within, which gives some sort of framework for my life. It's actually almost the opposite to that. It's the idea that myself is the most important thing and the world needs to conform to the way I feel, and the reality around me needs to conform to the way I feel, and we get this idea of the self or the authentic self. You've probably heard of that word. And even the way our children are educated, we're going to see, is flavoured by this sort of thinking. And so education is designed to assist me to explore who I really am and to allow me to develop the ideas and the authentic self. Not so much today, is the education preparing me to meet the demands of the world in which I live. That's sort of been left behind. It's more about the internal self. One of the sources for some of this material is a gentleman by the name of Carl Trueman, who wrote a book called The Strange New World. And he defines the modern self in this way. He says, the modern self assumes that the authority of the inner feelings and sees authenticity as defined by the ability to give social expression to the same. So the modern self is the ability to express our own feelings in a way that we want to. Another scholar has used this expression, expressive individualism, and he defines expressive individualism as holding that each person has a unique core feeling and intuition that should unfold or be expressed if individuality is being realised. In other words, each one of us has this core identity which is within us. We were born with it, and our challenge in life is to realise that expression, to express that, to find whatever way we can be expressed in the way we like. So one seeks to give expression to our inner selves, rather than so much seeing ourselves as part of a community and bounded by the reality of the world we live in, being sort of conforming or bounded by the natural laws or the laws that appear in the world around us. So authenticity is a word which has been given to these inner feelings. And so rather than accepting some sort of transcendent natural law, or even the idea that God has laws in place, it puts all of that aside and makes the governor of how we live our life our inner feelings. Again, another philosopher, Charles Taylor, he talks about this culture of authenticity, and he says it's one where each one of us has his or her own way of realising out of humanity, and that it is important to find and live out one's own as against surrendering to the conformity with the model imposed on us from outside by society or a previous generation or a religious or political authority. So we need to let go of all of that authority and all the other inputs which might have been there in past generations. We need to let them go in order that we can be authentic in the way that we live our life. And this is really not just a passive thing, it's a very active thing that's being pursued. We ought to be active in pursuing this idea. And again, another author, Philip Reif, who wrote a book entitled The Triumph of the Therapeutic Self, he writes that one is no longer accountable to either a creator God or even a set of moral norms designed by the community that has service as its underlying principle in the context of reality, but to the authority of the therapists who counsel us to be true to oneself. So if you think about historically, we talk about something like sexual orientation, which was not even a consideration a couple of generations ago. It was just assumed that in general that a man and woman would unite, they'd be married, and they would have a family, and that was the way the world worked. That was the structure and the framework of the world in which we lived in. Our gender was determined by the physicality of our body, and if my grandfather went along to a doctor and said something like, "I feel like I'm a woman trapped in a man's body," first of all, my grandfather would never have said that, and secondly, it would not have made sense in the time of my grandfather. If my father went along to the same doctor or his doctor and said, "I feel like I'm a woman trapped in a man's body," the doctor would have said, "That's very interesting. What we'll do is we'll send you to a psychologist because we need to work through and have a think about your mind, because we need to correct that way of thinking," which is unfortunate. But of course, if you go along to a doctor today and say, "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body," it's actually, well, technically in Victoria, illegal for a doctor to not affirm what you're saying. And so you could be offered all sorts of blockers and all sorts of things, even surgery, in order to change your body to reflect what you're thinking. And so you can see what's changed over just one generation. What's changed is the reality of the world we lived in was a primary reality, and our thinking and the way we lived in the world was governed by the structure and the world which God has created. It was our living was governed by that. But in the space of a generation, it's all changed, and now our reality of life, according to this philosophy, is governed by the way we feel, and what we can then do is we can go and change the reality of the world in which we live. Up until 2013, the US Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders referred to gender identity as a disorder. Now that's changed. And as we say, if you go along to a doctor today and talk about these things, surgery, hormone therapy, and all sorts of things will be made available to you so that you can change your body, you can change the physical world in which you live so that your body can be brought in line with the way you think, so that you can express your authentic self. But there's actually a bit more to it than that, isn't it? If that's all it was, I suppose you'd say, well, we'll let people do sort of what they think they need to do, and so that might be the case. Probably everyone could get on and do what they want to do in their life. But it's not quite that simple. It's a bit like same-sex marriage. The same thing has happened. You see, same-sex marriage legislation was never really about hospital visitation visits. It was never about, so when one partner died, would they have the rights to the house and those sorts of things. All of those sort of arguments that were put up, that was really not what it was about, was it? It was really all about the idea of supporting or moving from acceptance to affirmation. It's not any longer about just allowing me to behave in a way that I feel like I want to behave. It's now moved from that. It's moved to, this is who I am. In order for me to be validated as a being, as a human being, you need to validate who I am. You need to agree with my identity. And so, whilst we might have differences with the way people behave, that is simply just not enough today. And we have statements like this, which, when you think about it, is an extraordinary statement when you think of the world we live in. When Joe Biden says transgender equality is the civil rights issue of our time. Of all of the things you think that might be important today, Joe Biden thinks that's the most important. Now, all of this, of course, has come right on the heels of what is known as the sexual revolution. And perhaps with sort of looking back over those 5 or 6 decades, it's perhaps a little bit different to what people might have assumed it was as it was happening. Most sort of assumed the sexual revolution was something like, well, we don't really think God exists. We don't really think God cares about how we live our life or what I do with my body. Who makes the rules anyway? And so they sort of took down sort of the morals that were in the world at the time, and sort of people then sort of slackened off the rules, and sexually people were able to do more than what they were able to do in previous generations that were somewhat governed by the morals that come from the Judeo-Christian sort of tradition. But it turns out, in retrospect, the sexual revolution was actually much more than that. And going back to a quote from Carl Trueman, he says, regarding the sexual revolution, it's a repudiation, actually, of the very idea of codes in their entirety. And more than that, he's talking about the sexual revolution, it requires a positive repudiation of traditional sexual mores to the point where belief in or maintenance of such views has come to be seen as ridiculous and even a sign of serious mental or moral deficiency. So the first thought might be, well, but we still live in a world that has some sort of sexual ethics. There's still a moral framework, it's just the goalposts have been moved. It's a little bit wider today than perhaps it was, in the 40s or 50s before the sexual revolution in the 60s. For example, pedophilia is certainly not acceptable today, and obviously rape or incest and things like that are not acceptable today. So there's still a moral framework that's in place. But if you think about it, it's actually not like that at all. In fact, what might appear to be a moral framework based on sexual ethics is not that. When you think about it, these are a framework based on choice. Matters of personal choice. And so the reason that rape is not acceptable in the world today, and the reason pedophilia is not acceptable in the world today, is not so much to do with the sexual mores, it's to do with choice. It's to do with whether we are giving people the opportunity to choose. And so a child which is not able to choose for themselves, not in a position to assent to sexual activity, ought not be interfered with. Rape is not acceptable because someone is not accepting of that. And so it's not actually a sexual more, it's actually to do with personal rights. And so, in fact, there's really very little left of any idea of sexual mores left. Again, quoting Carl Trueman, he says, sexual acts in themselves are seen as having no intrinsic moral significance. It is the consent or not of those engaging in them that provides the moral framework. And so you get a sense of just how things have changed in such a short period of time. And so the question which we want to try and get to tonight is, how did we get here? And what's caused this change? What's the underlying thinking? We can sort of say, well, people don't believe in God anymore. Well, it's not that simple because it's far more deep than that. And so what we want to go back and have a look at is the foundations which go right really back to Greek philosophy. And the underlying philosophy which I'd suggest to you is dualism, goes right back to at least the Greeks, 2,500 years ago. And one of the key philosophies of these Greeks, and in particular a man who you would have heard of by the name of Plato, who lived just after the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, so he lived around that time in Greece. And he was one of the key proponents of this idea of dualism. And the idea of dualism is this idea of powers of good and evil and the mental world versus the physical world. In fact, if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see Wikipedia says that dualism refers to something that's divided into two or opposed aspects. The second one, the religious doctrine that the universe contains opposed powers. So there's powers of good versus the powers of evil, and they're sort of balanced to keep the world in place. But also in philosophy, the idea of dualism refers to a theory or system of thought that regards the domain of reality in terms of two independent principles, especially the mind and matter. And that's this idea of mind versus matter. And what we're going to see actually, although Wikipedia sort of says there's two sort of different ways that you can look at dualism, we're going to see that they're actually quite closely tied together. And so we have PC's not behaving, there we go. The mind is the highest form of that which is good. And so what we're going to see is the idea of good is matched with the mind, and then, as you would assume then, the physical world or matter is linked with that which is temporary and that which is evil. Now, this is particularly interesting, and we can sort of go off on a lot of different tangents with this, but we'll actually see that this forms the basis of where in the early Christian world, a few decades after Christ, the idea of the devil comes into the Christian thinking. And so, in fact, we're not going to go into it now, but you can actually go and Google Christian Platonism and see where the idea of the immortality of the soul came from. So this idea that there's a separation between the mind, which was the soul as it became to be known by the early Christians, and the body. And of course, late in the 1st century and into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, as Greeks learnt about Christ and became Christians, they brought with them a lot of the thinking and philosophy that was already in place, and in particular this sort of thinking, this idea that there's a mind and body, two separate parts of the world, two different realities, and the idea that the world, the physical world is evil and that the spiritual world is the important thing. And so even the idea that the world is going to be destroyed, blown up and destroyed and we're all going to go to heaven actually comes out of this dualism philosophy, and it was adopted into Christian thinking late in the 1st century and 2nd and 3rd centuries. And so we have the devil and so on. Well, moving on past this time through the decades of Christianity, there was a gentleman by the name of René Descartes. He was a famous dualist, probably dualist theorist. He was probably the most famous. He was a French philosopher, an amazing mathematician and scientist. He invented geometry, so for those who hate maths, you probably don't like this gentleman, but we wouldn't be here, we wouldn't have roads or anything if it wasn't for this guy who invented geometry. He had a few interesting sayings. It's not enough to have a good mind, the main thing is to use it well. He said, conquer yourself rather than the world. And he's most famous for the expression, which you might have heard of, I think, therefore I am. And we're going to resist the temptation to get into that too much. But you may have seen that picture before, the famous dualist picture. His theory was that all things are reducible to two separate realities, two different realities, the body and the mind. And what we're going to see is that this thinking pervades the world and was adopted, was always there right through Christianity, right through the decades, right through the centuries, but became very prevalent after these philosophers in the 1500s and 1600s. And so there's a foundation of modern thinking, and that is this sort of culture of authenticity. So it's the separation of the body and mind, this idea of expressive individualism, all comes from sort of this underlying theory or philosophy of dualism. And Descartes was a Christian, and so his ideas were very consistent with the orthodox Christian view that man has an immortal soul. This is the divine spark in a man, and that's what's important, that's what God is going to save. But the body, by contrast, is part of the material world. God's not interested in it. In fact, the material world's going to be destroyed by God, and everyone is going to live in ethereal bliss forever. That was the orthodox teaching for centuries and centuries, and that's where that thinking comes from. But of course, that thinking was never part of the gospel message. Now, apart from the fact that we don't have an immortal soul, the dichotomy between the mental and the physical is a dichotomy which is never expressed like that in the Bible. It was never taught by God. And we'll come back to dualism and see just how important and the implications that has in the world we live in today. But it was on this basis that many of the more recent thinkers have built their philosophies on this idea of dualism. So if you think about dualism, you think about the mind and the body. So the mind is sort of God and it's eternal, it's the essence of the person, whereas the physical, which is evil, it's temporary and it's of secondary importance. So God is interested in saving your immortal soul, but the earth and all the material things are going to be burnt up. Well, if we fast forward just a century or so, we come to another significant thinker, a gentleman by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau lived in the 1700s, and he was essentially one of the architects that started the French Revolution, and before that was significant in being involved in the preparation of the American Declaration of Independence. And this whole idea of the pursuit of liberty and the pursuit of happiness was a lot of that thinking came from this gentleman, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau in many ways was considered to be the most influential modern philosopher. His reforms revolutionised taste, first in music and then in other arts. He changed the way we educate children. He further expressed emotion rather than a polite restraint in friendship. He opened people's eyes to the beauties of nature, and he made liberty an object of almost universal aspiration. Things that you and I just assume that people have always thought down through centuries. We assume that that's what everyone always thought. But actually, when you go back and look at it, that was not the way people thought before Jean-Jacques Rousseau introduced the idea. And it was this gentleman who introduced what became known as the Romantic period, where people thought romantically about things. They thought about beauty and aesthetics, and that becomes an important part of our life, which was far less important in the years gone by. Now, to illustrate the way this particular gentleman has changed the world we live in, it's interesting to compare these two books. They're both called Confessions, and Rousseau wrote a book which he called Confessions. Now, this was not just a coincidence that the book was of the same name as a book that St. Augustin wrote in the 5th century. Now, most of us probably don't know who St. Augustin was. He was an Orthodox Christian, wrote enormous amounts of volumes, and he was one of the fathers of the Orthodox Church. That, well, for example, in the book Confessions, he coined the idea of original sin. And his argument was that we are all essentially evil, and from us comes evil. And actually, Augustine tells the story that when he was a young man, he was not hungry, and what happened is him and a few mates, they jumped over the fence, and this is a very rough interpretation of what he wrote, with some liberties probably. He jumped over the fence and he pinched the fruit from the ladies next door's garden and went around. They tossed it around and threw it and got rid of it. And his argument was, we weren't hungry, we didn't need the fruit, we were just being mischievous, we were just evil, it was in us. And so this idea of original sin, that we are essentially evil, we are in a fallen state before God, and we need redemption by God, was his thinking. And we would agree with him on that. So Rousseau writes a book, and he calls his book Confessions in the same way. And he writes, surprisingly, a very similar story. And he says he was with some mates, and they went next door and they pinched the fruit from the lady next door. And he says, well, I didn't like the fruit, we didn't want the fruit, but why did I steal the fruit? He said, well, I didn't actually want to steal the fruit. It was because of my mates. It wasn't because of me. And so his argument was, I'm actually essentially a good person, but it was all my mates that made me do a bad thing. And so from Rousseau's theory came the idea that essentially we're born good, but we come into a society which is essentially evil, and so we learn to be evil, and we're influenced by evil people around us. And so the idea that children are born innocent and good and lovely little children, and they won't do anything bad until they're influenced by the evil society. And if we can get children and we can sort of protect them from the evil that is around them and sort of look after them so that they're not influenced, then they will grow up and be authentically good. That was his argument. And do you think we don't see that today in perhaps ways we've never seen it before? And without getting into the detail, that's why you get someone like Greta Thunberg, who gets invited to speak to the United Nations, because she's seen to be an authentic, innocent young person that hasn't been corrupted by the evil capitalist society in which we live. This idea that authentically we are essentially good. And so this man, Rousseau, had a huge effect on the places of education. He really changed the way that education is being delivered. Places of education became places of performance, of self-expression, places to give expression to the yet to be corrupted internal voice, as opposed to what they were before, places where nature is to be understood and restrained. And so school before Rousseau was basically kids attending and being told what to think. And after Rousseau, it was more about, allowing kids to express themselves and to learn at their own level. So, and like all of these things, there's no right or wrong in them necessarily. There's some good in all these things, but what we'll see is the underlying thinking was developed. So even the music that you and I like, he changed the idea of music and how we like music. The way we express our romantic life was changed. Your expectations from your marriage are different today than what they would have been in the 14th century before Rousseau changed the way we think. I know we're all sitting there thinking, actually, I think, I've got a clear mind. I think what I think. Rousseau's not changing the way I think. Rousseau has changed the way we think. It's an amazing, it's something you kind of almost need to sit down and think about. But we are incredibly affected by the philosophy without even knowing it. The belief that our circumstances mitigate our responsibility of crime and other things. So the way we even our justice system works is mitigated by these ideas from Rousseau. And so he developed, I guess, two key ideas that came from sort of his way of thinking. First of all, the idea that was built on dualism, and that is the idea of a self, this inner psychological self, these inner feelings which are independent to our body and the reality of the world we live in, and the fact that we are essentially born good, that as children we're pure. Society corrupts us as we grow and integrate in society, and we become lustful and seek for things over and above what we perhaps legitimately might gain. And so he coined the phrase wild savage as an exemplar of a free man who was uncorrupted from civilization, a man who just runs wild, who's not affected by the evil society. And some of you would have read The Lord of the Flies, which was written by William Golding, and William Golding wrote that book in answer to this theory, in answer to Rousseau's theory. He writes a book and says, that's simply not true. If you take a bunch of kids and put them on an island with no influences, evil will come. And that was the whole idea of Lord of the Flies, for those who have read it, was a challenge to this theory. Well, romantic poets believe that one should write from their emotions and their inner feelings on a topic rather than think about the topic and its impact and its consequences. And that's sort of where the romantic period came from. Yet the interesting thing is that all of these people and the people around Rousseau who then moved into and started the French Revolution, they were all Christians. They were actually Catholics. They still had a moral compass. They still believed in sort of a natural law. They believed that God created the earth and there was certain rules and ways we ought to live in the creation that God has created. And that idea that God was there mitigated their theories. And so what we see is these ideas and philosophies didn't actually work their way out until some years later, when the idea that God is our creator and there is a natural law in place which moderate and mitigate the way we live our life, until that was taken away, we didn't see too many changes. Well, a few years later, along comes a gentleman by the name of Karl Marx, and we've heard of him, and he introduces the idea of the struggle between sort of capitalists and the working class. And he gives Christianity, he sets Christianity up as an example of a class struggle. He says, things like husbands should be faithful to their wives. Well, that's just who says that's true. Husbands should not drink too much so they can be more productive. The doctrine of honesty and working hard for your employer. Wives should be at home busy with their children. All of these sorts of things he sees as oppressive things that are put in place by the capitalists in order that people might work harder. And so he rejects all of that, the whole idea that we ought to be stable and sober, that we ought to be compliant. All of that, says Karl Marx, needs to be thrown out. And so this idea of rich versus poor, class struggle was introduced by Karl Marx, and that you'll see very much in the society we live in today. Well, again, crossing over with Karl Marx, of course, another gentleman who we know well is Charles Darwin. He lived around the same time, and Charles Darwin's proposition, of course, was that all species of life have descended from a common ancestor, and that now becomes generally accepted and considered as a fundamental concept of science. The amazing thing, or the important thing about Charles Darwin, is this was obviously a significant change in the history of the world in which we live, the philosophical world in which we live, because finally there's an accepted alternative to the reality of a transcendental power. All of a sudden there's an alternative to believing that God actually exists. There's an alternative to believing that God created the world we live in, and there's an expectation as to how we should live in the world. And so from this point on, we see philosophies and the way people think start to change quite considerably. Other important thinkers, Friedrich Nietzsche, which many of you would have heard of, who lives now a few decades after Darwin. He comes in with the context that there is no God. And he was the guy that said, famous statement, of course, that God is dead, which wasn't a statement that there is no God, that was assumed. The fact that he says God is dead is the question, well, if God is dead, then where do we get our values from? Who decides what's right and wrong if we have no God, now that God is dead? And so that was Nietzsche's challenge in his life, was to try and work out, well, how do we find meaning in our life? People who believed that God was there and he had a purpose for us and that we ought to live in a certain way and there's a life eternal that we can look forward to. If all of that's gone, why are we here? What do we do with our life and how do we find meaning? And he comes up with the idea of suggesting, well, you need to create a self. You need to choose who you are and live to that self. And Nietzsche was really the one that came up and really developed the idea, which was introduced by Rousseau, of aesthetics. And he spoke of taste. Moral sentiments are a preference or a taste. So whatever sort of feels good, whatever doesn't disgust you, then that's okay. It's the idea of taste. So moral sentiments are a matter of aesthetics. Those things that sort of feel right to us, that sort of seem okay. That was really Nietzsche, and that language has come down to us today. In fact, you'll often find that instead of people talking about something that is right or wrong, sort of a moral decision, you'll hear people say something like, that remark or that response is hurtful. The idea that you're presenting is offensive. Now, no one cares whether it's right or wrong. What's important is it offensive or not? See, we've moved away from a moral conversation to an aesthetics. How does it make you feel? Whether it's right or wrong is of no interest. Your viewpoint makes me feel unsafe. You see how aesthetics has taken over from morals. Morals are no longer important. There's no longer a right and wrong in that sense. It's real. What's important is how you make me feel. And so you can see what we've done is we've sort of done away with the framework of the moral natural law which God's put in place, and what is important now is how we feel. And so the ultimate goal of Nietzsche, which really has been realised today in ways that we couldn't possibly imagine, is that we ought to create the inner self and live authentically to that inner self that we would like to be. Well, along comes, or crossing over even Nietzsche, of course, another famous thinker which you would have heard of was Sigmund Freud. Again, we're obviously moving through this reasonably quickly, and just picking out some of the ideas that were and how they developed. Most known for sort of the father of psychoanalysis, although most of his theories have been debunked now, and actually psychotherapists don't use any of Freud's ideas, as far as I understand. But he does have a legacy in two particular areas, and they pervade our culture today. He basically said two things. He said sex is the foundation for all human happiness, and he came up with a theory of civilization. Now, obviously, it's grossly sort of simplified, but this idea that we are ostensibly a sexual person, and the ultimate expression of happiness is the way we express ourselves sexually. And so sexual orientation and who we are sexually becomes then a key component of who we are as an individual, something that had never really been considered before, something that no one ever talked about before Freud comes along and makes this suggestion. And so, the whole idea, based on, you start with Rousseau, who talks about the most important thing in life is happiness and fulfillment, hence the American Constitution, which talks about the pursuit of happiness. Freud says, well, the ultimate happiness is your ultimate sexual expression, therefore the ultimate you is your sexual self. And so you ought to then be authentic and be able to do the things that you want to do in your own life. And you shouldn't be corrupted by the people around you, or you shouldn't have restrictions or morals presented to you, based on someone else's idea. We'll pass over the Frankfurt School reasonably quickly. It's a more recent group of philosophers, and from the Frankfurt School, you can Google it yourself and have a look at it. It's fascinating to read about the Frankfurt School. Mostly, again, French philosophers, and one of the things that came out of the Frankfurt School was this idea of critical race theory now being broadened into critical theory, which really questions everything. And now critical theory moves from race critical theory into even critical theory of history, the re-looking at history through a different lens, and so on. And so we could spend a lot of time on that. It's actually quite interesting. And so what we're seeing is a development of a way of thinking. So the history, as we look back to see how we got to where we are, looks something like this. We looked at the very sort of the regeneration or the renewal of this idea of mind versus body, the personal versus material. Then Jean-Jacques Rousseau talked about the authentic self and being born authentic, that sort of we're born innocent, but we're corrupted by the world, the social world in which we live. Karl Marx talked about a struggle of power, the working class versus the capitalists, and it's all about power. Charles Darwin brought in the idea that, well, there's no need for a God, there's an alternative to God, and so God is dead, as Nietzsche said. Nietzsche introduces the idea of self-actualization, self-identity. We are to craft our own identity without any other transcendental purpose. We just need to decide what that is for ourselves. Sigmund Freud sexualizes that self-identity. So self is essentially all about one's sexuality. And so now when we identify ourselves, we're straight or we're gay or we're this or we're married or we're not, that becomes part of our identity, an idea which would never have entered anybody's mind before the last century, before Nietzsche and Freud put those things in place. And then we live in a world where we have the enablers. The enablers are my term, but what I think has made all of what we see in the world today a reality. You think, well, okay, so all of these ideas have been rattling around for decades and decades. Why are we seeing this explosion of ideas today? Well, it's because we have these enablers. Information technology, both software and hardware. The mobile phone has been a huge enabler. Medical technology has been a huge enabler. Without medical technology, most of these theories are just theories. They don't actually mean anything. We've never been able to alter our physical world that we live in like we can today because of the technology we live in. The sexual revolution would never have been possible without contraception. Transgender discussions are never even a discussion without hormone therapy and surgery that's available today. Drugs to counteract sexual transmitted diseases and antivirals for HIV. All of these, this technology, this medical technology that is around today, which enables people to live a life different to the world, the way the world is showing us that we ought to live our life. Social connectivity and cross-border tribal behaviour. 15 years ago, you would probably live your whole life and you may never meet someone who is transgender or has a gender issue. You go your whole life without meeting somebody. But of course today, when people live their lives on their phone, their digital world, if you like, what they're finding is they're looking at their TikTok and their Instagram pages, and because that's the sort of thing they're interested in, that's the sort of thing they're being fed, and so what people are thinking is, this is the real world. And there are thousands and thousands of people in their digital world, in their new digital space, which are affirming the way that they might think and suggesting ways that they ought to live their life differently to what might have been done otherwise. And so today we are flooded with all sorts of ideas that are coming from all sorts of different places from the globe that even 100 years ago we would never have, or even 20 years ago we would never even heard about. And certainly 100 years ago we would never have even considered. Imagine living in the 1400s and your father's a blacksmith. The reality of your life is that you are governed by your circumstances. You will most likely be a blacksmith. You will most likely marry a girl or a boy that lives within, a few kilometres of where you live. You will never leave that space. You will probably be the same religion that your parents are, etc., etc. The world is completely different today because now we can change where we live. We can change where we want to be. We can change the person we want to be. And so the world has completely changed. And what's really interesting to think about is there's two key enablers, I think, which stand out. You think about all of the enablers in the world we live in. There's two key enablers. The first one is education, and the whole idea that you can be whoever you want to be. You can choose who you want to be. The whole idea is, that you can be whoever you want to be. Very common saying. Education, number one, and number two, mobility. The ability to move around and meet different people and get out of that. By contrast, the village in the 1400s, where you had no mobility. You lived in your little space and that was where you lived your life, possibly within a few kilometres of where you were born. Today we have education and mobility. And I find it amazing that when God is talking to Daniel and he talks about the time of the end is characterised by two characteristics, and that is by those who roam to and fro and have knowledge. And it's really fascinating to me that that's how God describes the world at the end to Daniel. Well, let's go back to where we started tonight and this idea of dualism, and just quickly look at how this idea of dualism actually affects the way we think today. So we have two different types of being. We've talked about what dualism is. We have the way we think, what we like and what we value, the music we like and the art we like, the creativity, the way we think about God, our morality. And that's sort of all sort of part of us, isn't it? And you might say, well, that's true for you, but it's not really true for me. And then we have the physical world, and ironically enough, people say, well, that's not up for debate. If you want to talk to someone about evolution or science or something like that, it's like, well, no, the science is the science. We follow the science. You can't, that's not a discussion. But if you want to talk about morality, well, you have yours and I'll have mine. It's whatever you want to be. And this sort of idea, the difference between our body and our mind has become known as Personhood Theory. So just to sort of flesh this out a bit, think about who you are. Going back to the original question, who do you think you are? Are you a brain or are you a body? I mean, if you had a car accident and you lost two of your legs, which would be most unfortunate, you would still be you, right? You're still a person. You're still the same person, and you wouldn't think you're any different. Unable to walk, obviously, but you're still the same person. What if in the car accident you lost two legs, two arms, and your ears? Or perhaps you were blind. Would you still be you? Would you say, yeah, I'm still me? Well, what about if you lost everything and you're just a brain? Is that still you? So you can see the difficulty of this. Like, who actually are we? And what we suggest tonight is actually that's an impossible question to answer in the sense that we are a complete being. We are our body and our mind, and to make a distinction between the two is incorrect. But let's see how this distinction, or this, it's called Personhood Theory, the idea that as a person we are our mind, that's the idea of person. And so mentally, that's who we are, and our body is sort of just part of the material world and not that important. Abortion is where this becomes particularly important. And underlying the arguments of abortion is the fact that, well, a fetus is a human thing, but it's not a person. Because it can't think and it doesn't have a memory, therefore it's just human tissue, and so it can be discarded. And we'll pass over some of the slides I've got on this. But the important thing, of course, is that mentally, if we have a mental position in the world, then we have a moral and legal standing, but a fetus, for example, is expendable and biological. And so abortion basically has the underlying philosophy of dualism. What about euthanasia? This is a subject which is going to come to the fore. The idea of whether euthanasia is legitimate or not. And again, it has this same sense behind it. If you have a memory and you're self-aware, then you're a person. But if you've lost your memory, you can no longer remember anything, perhaps you're in a vegetative state, you're no longer a person, you're just human tissue, the person is no longer present. And so we then justify euthanasia. And euthanasia is something that is definitely coming and is becoming an issue and is a real challenge. And I think it will challenge us in the way we think. Personhood teaches us that the human who has lost their memory is struggling to be rational, perhaps isn't self-conscious, is simply just not a person. And so they have no intrinsic value, and so that their life can be forfeited or given up. What about sexuality? Well, if consciously or subconsciously you see the body as being separate from us as a person, then what you do with your body does not affect who you are as a person. And really that is underlying the way the world thinks about how we behave sexually. What you do sexually really has no impact on who you are. It's just an activity which you can choose to do or not do at your will. In fact, people are taught, keep your heart and maintain your independence, and with your body, you can go and do with it whatever you want. In fact, there is educational material out there teaching young people not to confuse sex with love, and to actually teach that you can actually participate in sexual activity and it should be independent of love and how you see other people. And that's the way sexual activity is seen by many people in the world today. But of course, this is so different to the way God sees us. God's view is that we are an integrated person and that a physical union is designed to supplement long-term commitment. And we need to do ourselves and our friends, our young people, a favour and teach them the value of sexuality and to remind people that this, although it's a good theory, it's actually incorrect, both from the point of view that God says it's wrong, but also the reality of it is that it does affect people. Same-sex behaviour. You can see how this theory of dualism underlies this whole idea of same-sex behaviour. How you feel determines what you do. Your body and how it's made is of no relevance. And so underlying this whole same-sex explosion of, if you like, is dualism. It's fundamental to this idea. Gender fluidity is probably the most obvious way that we can see how dualism presents. How you feel determines what gender you are and what you do with your body. Physical characteristics are just there to be manipulated, changed, or ignored if that's your preference. Body obsession might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but body obsession is the same idea. How you feel, how you want to be perceived needs to be supported by your body. And so the body can be pierced, it can be altered, it can be drawn on, it can be manipulated. It's a canvas. It's just there for your pleasure. It's there for your manipulation. Do with your body whatever you will, whatever makes you feel good, whatever expresses who you think you really are. This is dualism. It's the separation of mind and body. But that's not how God has created us. You know, if we go right back to the first century, there were the Gnostics, and this is exactly the teaching of the Gnostics. You might have heard of the Gnostics. The Gnostics were those who separated, and they were Platonists. They were thinking along the lines of Plato. They were usually Greeks. And they said, with my mind I believe in God. With my mind I acknowledge God. With my mind I esteem and I worship God. God's not interested in my body. It's going to be destroyed. God's not interested in what I do with my body. And so I can go and do whatever I like. I can behave however I like. God's not interested in that. God's of a higher level. And so the Gnostics tried to separate the mind and body, and that's a lot of, if you read 1 John, for instance, 1 John really is an argument, a letter which argues against this sort of thinking. Well, as our evening comes to an end, we'll look at just a few quotes to finish off. 1 John chapter 4, verse 1 and 3 says, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they be of God, because many false prophets are gone into the world. And hereby we know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is God. And every spirit that confesses not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God." So the Gnostics were teaching that Jesus Christ, because he's so wonderful, because he's God, then he didn't come in the flesh because the flesh is evil. This whole idea of the flesh versus the evil. So they denied that that Jesus came in the flesh. But God's purpose with us is that we are made in the image of God. We are not a mind with a body. We are human beings. We are embodied. We are minds with bodies. Romans chapter 8, verse 19. "For the creation awaits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subject to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in the hope that creation itself will be set free." Going to the bottom there, "We wait eagerly for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies." So our Heavenly Father sees us as an integrated human being, created by him in his image. And that's how we ought to behave. And so resurrection becomes so important. And that's why the doctrine of resurrection is not just a minor sort of deviation from the idea that we might go to heaven. It's actually fundamentally at odds with the idea of going to heaven, not just in location, but in the whole concept of who we are. "So it is with the resurrection, so with the dead," says Paul. "It is sown a natural body and raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body." And so the bodies that we're going to be raised with are bodies that are driven or energised by the Spirit as opposed to the flesh. Might skip over a couple. Romans 6, considered it last night. "We know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. Do not present your members to sin as instruments for unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments to righteousness." The word instruments is our body. The things you do with your body, says Paul, they need to reflect God's righteousness. "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one to whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or obedience, which leads to righteousness?" So Paul wants us to understand that we don't have bodies, we are bodies, and with our body we are to reflect the glory of God. And so we can actually be confused by this. We can actually, even in our own life, actually segment ourselves. We can actually have a dualistic approach to life. We can say, well, mentally and spiritually on a Sunday morning, that's my life, I'm sort of spiritual. But, during the week I have this secular approach to life. In my spiritual life I respond to God, and in my secular life I sort of pursue my own interests. That's sort of a dualistic approach to our life in general. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 13, we could spend a lot of time in this particular chapter where Paul talks about the way we behave ourselves, and he makes the point that God raised Jesus bodily. He actually makes the point that we are members, our bodies are members of Christ. A really important chapter. So I'll finish with this idea. What we're being told by the scriptures is we ought to view ourselves as an integral human being. The mental is the way we think, and it's represented, of course, by Jesus Christ. Our physical body is the way we behave as a result of the way we think. And that's seen in the type of the Lord Jesus Christ with the ecclesia, an integrated unity of being. And Paul says, and he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, for in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. This idea of us being bodies in entirety, integrated human beings, is vital to the way we understand our Heavenly Father. And just for the young people, just to finish off where we started, have a think about these lyrics and see how these lyrics really are an expression of this way of thinking. You can see the argument here. When you dream of home tonight, there is no message we're receiving. In other words, you're not being told what you need to think. Let me know if your heart's still beating. Are we human or are we dancing? I'm looking for the answer. Pay my respects to grace and virtue. In other words, they've been great, but we're going to leave them behind now because what I'm doing is I'm finding the authentic self. So I'm not interested in grace and virtue. Send my condolences to good. No longer is good going to determine what I do with my life because I'm going to be authentic. I'm not going to be dictated to by what people might think is good or bad. Give my regards to soul and romance. They always did the best they could. So long to devotion. Things like devotion are no longer important. That's being dictated by other people. They tell me I should be devoted, but I'm not going to be devoted. You taught me everything I know. Wave goodbye, wish me well. You've got to let me go. Are we human or are we dancer? The choice, according to the killers, is we either need to be authentically human or we just dance the dance. And the idea of the dancer, of course, is just going through the motions and dancing and doing the things that everyone has done for generations and generations. So do you just want to dance or do you want to be authentically human? And so it's amazing to see that this sort of thinking is in the lyrics of songs that we hear on the radio every day. And it's built into the philosophy of the world we live in, and the enablers today is what's allowing it to flourish in the world in which we live. So we need to respond to understand how our Heavenly Father wants us to view ourselves and respond appropriately by living an integrated life in the way we think and the way we behave before our God. Thanks, Gary.